tonight's meeting. It's my honor to welcome our guest, Pastor Samuel Vogel. He preaches at the International Evangelical Church in Helsinki. He has a master's in theology from Tübingen University. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but hopefully it's close enough. He's also studied at Princeton, Leipzig, and Helsinki, and he's going to discuss the Bible Canon with us. So thanks so much, Pastor Samuel, for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Matt, and all of you. And thank you for that question. It's a topic that, not everybody would want to talk about, but I believe it's actually quite important. And I remember years ago that I was getting engaged in it a bit. And this is why when you were mentioning, Matt, that you thought of maybe looking into that, I thought, well, I could even come along because it's a great topic. And it's also a messy topic. It's not one of those things where you can say right away, this is how it works. These are the answers. It involves a historical process that spans hundreds, actually more than 1,000 years. And the question is, how do we end up having the Bible that we have with the books in it? And we might be coming now from different denominations. Most of us probably have a Protestant background, but if you would have some Catholics among us, I don't know, William, what is your background, for example? We would realize that even the Bibles that we have, even if they're in the same language, they might have some of the books in different orders, slightly different orders. Catholics and Orthodox have more books in their Bible than the others have. So why is that? And actually, the whole question of the biblical canon has to do with apologetics, because that question was kickstarted by challenges to the canon or to the biblical writings, to the church. Actually, the church seemed to have been doing pretty well. Even after Jesus' resurrection, there were for 100 years, even as the first New Testament books were written, there were no issues. But then both from inside and outside, that was challenged. And in response to that, I don't know how to say it, the canon came into being, or that question was discussed. But let's go to the very beginning, and I only show you quickly some of the things we could cover. And I'll have a look at the watch, so don't worry, this is not going to take hours. But I want to quickly just look at the question of terminology. What are we talking about when we talk about the canon? And then basically, let's look at the Old Testament. Let's look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and actually a bit more, as some of you know. Then let's look at the New Testament. And then at this process in the early church, how did they respond to all these writings? What decisions did they make, if you can call those decisions? That's another question. And then even let's look a bit ahead and go right to the Reformation and what happens then also in the Catholic Church. But actually, I don't need to show more than that. So we can go back to see our faces. So what does canon mean? The Jewish people, they didn't have that word, or they didn't use it. So when they talked about the Old Testament, that is a word that they did not use. It's only in the 4th century that it was applied to the biblical writings. And the word means something like measure, standard. And then from then on, we've been using it. And that's why we use it also outside the Bible for, canons of literature or whatever it is. But then what I would like to say at the very beginning, I said it's an apologetic question to talk about the canon, but at the end of the day, everything depends on whether God exists or not, whether he speaks or not through his Spirit, and also through the biblical writings. In other words, what I'm trying to say, we couldn't prove by everything we're talking tonight about that God exists or that he is actually speaking. We could be quite amazed about the process of the canonization, but we couldn't prove anything in the very end. So we're in a different position, like, for example, Muslims who have a very straightforward teaching. There is the original Quran with God. He told it Muhammad, and Muhammad wrote it down, and there it is. Very easy, very handy, very uncomplicated if you want. It's very different with this beautiful book that we have, the Bible. So let's very quickly go first to the New Testament and to the Old Testament. So when we talk about the Old Testament, one issue we have already is the time span. If you think of Moses, Abraham, even the patriarchs, we go back 2 millennia before Christ. But we are not sure when do we actually have the first writings. And some scholars would date everything very late and some a bit earlier, but there is easily, centuries and centuries and centuries, if not millennia, between events and the events written down, or then if they had been written down before they were collected and then edited and compiled to what we have as the Old Testament. If you just take the book of Psalms, some Psalms are attributed to David. David was made king around 1000. But then many Psalms come from a period of the exile or even later than that. So just that book and the prayers in it have been collected over 500 years. And then, we could go to the Septuagint and we say even that there's some ways how they're added differently. Some Psalms are combined and so on. So there's a long story in it. But when do we have the earliest traces in Judaism that a collection of books is recognized, considered as what we would say canonical, kind of sacred writings that are distinct from everything else? Maybe one of the earliest instances we have is from around the 2nd century before Christ. It has to do with a book that is included into the Greek Old Testament. It's the Septuagint. Jesus Sirach or Sirach, there's many ways to pronounce it. And in an introduction to that book that we don't know who wrote it, it could be a relative of the author, there's the first time a reference to the law, the prophets, and other writings. And so this is 200 before Christ. So already there seems to be what is very important in the Hebrew Old Testament, this 3 partition, that you have the law of Moses, then you have the prophetical books, and then you have other writings. And then basically, at least in terms of the sources that we have, it takes almost until the end of the 1st century after Christ to a guy that I'm sure Matt knows, that Josephus, who also wrote the Judean War. Very interesting. We get a lot of information from him about the time of the Gospels. He even mentions Jesus and his death. But he is the one who then talks about this collection of books that exists, and that again has not only these 3 partitions, but he even talks about why these books are selected. So it's the first time that we have somebody saying there's some sort of criteria. And those criteria are very interesting ones for Josephus. They had to be written in a prophetic period, and that period started with Moses, and then it ended with a Persian king, Artaxerxes. He's mentioned in the Bible. On top of that, there has to be a recognition that the author, as much as we know, has been inspired, and there has to be the character of holiness. Now you might wonder, this is funny characteristic. So it is not like natural science. It's not a mathematical formula, but these are the ways that we then can assume the Jewish people have been talking about the writings of the Old Testament in comparison to many, 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 many other writings. And that I forgot to say in the beginning in terms of terminology. So when we talk about canon, we talk about the writings that have been recognized as sacred writings that make up our Bible today. But then already it gets messy. You might have heard the word or term apocrypha or apocryphal books. And that's actually not a very clear term. For example, Lutherans or Reformed Christians might use that word to refer to some of the books that are included into the Catholic Bible, into the Septuagint, but that are not really recognized by the reformers. I made sure that in my Luther Bible that I have, there's always also these apocryphal books. But then the Catholics, they would call those books deuterocanonical books, so canonical books of a second order, and they would refer, when they would talk about apocryphal books, they would talk about hundreds of writings, both at the time of the Old Testament and the New Testament, that never were recognized really sacred writings for many reasons. Either that it was very doubtful who wrote them, even if they claimed to have been written by a prophet, or then later in the New Testament by an apostle. In some cases, it was very clear that the content did absolutely not match with what you could say is some kind of orthodox teaching that is present in all the other writings that were recognized. And some were also time-wise simply too late. But as we apply these terms already in the terminology, it's sometimes difficult when two books or two articles might talk about different things with the same words. But no matter, when Josephus writes towards the end of the first century, when he gives that list, he is basically giving us what we have today in the Old Testament, a canon of the books that we have, that includes the law, all the prophets, and then additional writings. An interesting detail about this one is that between this first mentioning of a possible list 300 years earlier and the end of the first century, so over these 300 years, you have different groups in Judaism. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots from the New Testament, and there were other groups as well. And all of these groups had slightly different understandings of which books are authoritative and which not. There were the Sadducees who didn't believe in the resurrection, and they really only considered the 5 books of Moses relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that they disregarded all the other books, but that was for them the core. Then you had some, today we would say charismaniacs, really crazy groups on the other side. And there was a lot of apocalyptic writings, Jewish writings, 2nd, 4th, Ezra, and many of these books. And they would consider all of those relevant and important. Ironically, it's the Pharisees that were exactly agreeing with the canon we have today. So they were the ones who stick to Moses, the Torah, all the prophets, and the additional writings. But it doesn't necessarily mean that just because the Pharisees were the only ones that were left after the temple was destroyed, Sadducees had no point of existing. After the war was lost, all the apocalyptic groups and the Zealots, there was no right for them to exist. Most of them had died. But the Pharisees were the only group that actually survived. And sometimes people say, well, that's the reason why the Old Testament canon is looking the way it does, because it's just the Pharisees who remained. But actually, between those two dates that I gave you, 200 years before Jesus' birth, 100 years later until the end of the first century, there's several sources who confirm that for all of these centuries, most of these books and these 3 parts of the Old Testament were considered as relevant. So it is not that it's just because the Pharisees were the leftovers that we go with what they have. And actually we see, and I will come back to these 3 parts because that's really interesting and important actually for us as we read the Old Testament. We see that in the New Testament. Jesus, he makes once this comment to the Pharisees where he says, upon you will come the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of Abel, the righteous, to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah. And what Jesus is doing, he's actually framing the Jewish canon. Abel, at the very beginning, the book of Genesis, and in the Hebrew canon, the last book is not Malachi, it is 2nd Chronicles, and this is Zechariah. So Jesus is saying over the entire period that the sacred writings, the holy writings are talking about, you have been transgressing against God.
Samuel, where was this verse in New Testament?
That is Matthew 23:35. 23:35. And another verse that we have in the New Testament is that famous Emmaus passage, the disciples on their way to Emmaus. And if you want to write it down, Luke 24:44, it says that Jesus is addressing them, and Jesus says, everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And there's many similar expressions, and they always mean, even Psalms means all the other writings as well. Sometimes it says law and prophets, but that means still the entire Old Testament as we have it with all the writings. The interesting thing is, however, that there was never a decision made per se that these are the books. Both Sirach and then 300 years later Josephus and everybody in between, they are just recording the books that are considered sacred. There was never a council, there was never a synod, there was never a majority vote. They're just describing something that happened. They're describing that, as Josephus would say, they have the character of holiness. These writings have something that other interesting writings that in part could even consider prophetic, like today we have theological Christian literature that we can read and recommend, and we say, this is, read it, this is has prophetic qualities. There's nothing wrong with that. But then there was an awareness that only to a certain number and set of scriptures, you could say that they have this element that none of these others have. But it was never a decision. It was never a council called together. You might find in Wikipedia or elsewhere, for many, many years, there was an assumption that there was actually at some stage a council 100 years after Christ, where the scribes or the Pharisees or those who remained made a decision, but that actually never happened. So there was literally never ever a decision like that. I mentioned this order of books. I don't show you any slides, but you could go to Wikipedia and just type Hebrew Canon, and then you can read something about it, and there's thousands of articles. But the interesting thing is really, as I said many times, you have the 5 books of Moses, and then everything else is called either prophets or writings. And there's the former prophets and Judges, Joshua, Ruth, Samuel, Kings. All of these are actually for the Jewish people prophetic books. So these are the early prophets. And then follow the later prophets. This is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then these 12 smaller prophets that sometimes appear in one book. And then you have all the other writings. So, Songs of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Proverbs, Job, Psalms. And then if you think of Psalms, they're ascribed to David, although other people also contributed to those. And David is considered a prophet, not only a king. And that means that really the entire Old Testament is considered by the Jewish people as a deeply, deeply prophetic writing. And that is why I'm emphasizing that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses is a prophet. And this is how the Jewish people were looking at all of these scriptures as scriptures that were prophetic. And prophetic doesn't mean foretelling the future, but speaking God's word into the present. And this is the quality these books had. That God's Spirit was using them to speak into present situations again and again and again. But now we cannot jump right away to the New Testament. And that is because we have the Septuagint. What is that? It's how do you describe it actually? In the 2nd century, the Old Testament was translated into Greek because by that time already the majority of Jews lived outside the Holy Land, around the Mediterranean. And that is why they needed these writings also in the Greek language. And then also for all those who were interested, there was a lot of proselytes in Antioch and Alexandria, together with Rome, the 3 biggest cities at that time. There was many people who were interested in the Jewish faith. But, if they first have to learn Hebrew, it's much more difficult. So let's translate it into the language everybody speaks. I believe it's until the 2nd century that also in Rome, Greek is actually the main language. It's not Latin. So that's the language everybody understands. So let's translate the Old Testament. But then the Septuagint is not only a translation because it includes books that are not included into the Hebrew canon. And this is a fascinating question. Most of us who come from a Protestant background, we have been taught that, well, the books that we have in our Bible, these are the biblical books, and everything else in the Septuagint and Catholic Orthodox Bibles, we have, the book of Tobit, the book of Maccabees, and all these other books. They're not really useful, and we just take that for granted. But it's actually not so easy, because at the time when the Septuagint is created, translated, and extended, we do not yet have the canon, the Hebrew canon, as defined as we have it at the end of the first century. And so those who were putting the Septuagint together, and for example, they included the book Jesus Sirach, which is not in the Hebrew canon, but which is in the Septuagint and was highly regarded by the people who edited it. They looked at these writings too as sacred writings. And I never remember, we had one of my New Testament teachers, he was quite knowledgeable about the Septuagint. And he used to say, when you look at the New Testament, it's written in Greek. And look at any quote that Paul, for example, is making from the Old Testament. Sometimes you struggle when you take your English or whatever kind of Bible and you want to look up that cross-reference in the Old Testament. It doesn't seem to match. Why is that? Well, because sometimes Paul is quoting from the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is the translation, but it's also sometimes, using different words. So it is not always 100%, as you never can translate 100% the same. Sometimes Paul mixes Hebrew, the Hebrew that he knew, and I'm convinced he did, and the Septuagint. And that means for the first Christians, as for the Jewish people around the Mediterranean, the Septuagint was sacred writing. Now, it is of course true that, none of these books that the Septuagint has adds something of a value that, we would be at loss without it. That's definitely not the case. But especially if you come from a Protestant tradition, maybe it's good to be a little bit careful about it. And we will see that it actually plays a role that in the early church and right to the Reformation, as I've been saying, in terms of defining and deciding what actually belongs into the Bible and what not. And even, just a side note, in the first 4 centuries, so when the Bible started to be translated, and then from the 2nd century, 3rd century, also into Latin, which then became, at least in the Western Church, the dominant language, they would always translate from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew text. And it was only Jerome in the 4th century who realized that actually we should go to the Hebrew text, who then started to learn Hebrew, and he was criticized for it. Even someone like Augustine criticized Jerome and said, the Septuagint is inspired much more so than the Hebrew canon. So we have a lot of, lacking information and misunderstanding and lack of understanding of the Hebrew tradition and the Hebrew canon. And so the Septuagint plays a huge role with those additional writings as well. But then let's go to the New Testament. It's much easier to, describe how it came into being, while you have, again, different, ways to date the New Testament. Some date all the writings a bit later, some date them a bit earlier. In the, I think, 60s, 70s in the UK, they had a famous New Testament theologian by the name of John A.T. Robinson. The interesting thing about him is he was a so-called God is dead theologian. So he didn't believe anything, but he wrote a book dating the New Testament. And he, as somebody who basically didn't believe in any of that, dated all these books with very good reason as early as no one else. And according to him, the earliest book of the New Testament would be maybe James, which could be written as early as 48. So if you think Jesus was crucified maybe around 33, so that's already 15 years later that we might have the first letter. Paul's oldest letter, first letter, is First Thessalonians, written around 50. And then Paul writes all his letters between 50 and 60. So within decades, most of the writings, or all of the writings of the New Testament, are written in a relatively short time span. Very soon, and actually partly at the same time as the New Testament, or those letters and Gospels are written, there's also starting to be other writings, just as is the case with the Old Testament. So I have, a few editions of it's called New Testament Apocrypha. So there's 20, 30, 40 Gospels. There's all kinds of writings attributed to Paul or Peter or others, and apocalyptic writings. Most of them either from very early on recognized as written by someone under a false name. So that's why they were discarded. Or when they were written by recognized people, still there was a distinct difference in the quality of the writings. So we have kind of the same that we had with Josephus and the New Testament writings. And then, of course, for the New Testament canon, there had to be a relation to the apostles. It had to be apostolic authorship, or in the case of Mark or Luke, people who had credible relations to the witnesses. But that happens in a very, very, very short time. Nonetheless, for the first Christians, all they had was the Old Testament. And that is something that we should think about again and again. As we will see now this Sunday when we think of Pentecost, I mean, Peter's getting up and preaching, and where is he going? He's going to the Old Testament, and Paul is doing the same. So they think about what has happened, who Jesus is, what he did. And to understand it, they don't have the New Testament. They're the ones who write it, and they find all their answers in the Old Testament, which is maybe the reason why for almost 100 years after maybe the earliest writing of the New Testament is written, it seems no debate at all, either about the Old Testament, which was for them the holy writing they had, nor about the Gospels and the letters of Paul, Peter, John, and so on, that were starting to circulate. So there was not any discussion, it seems, and the church was perfectly at peace, and the Holy Spirit seemed perfectly pleased and didn't think there's anything that they need to decide in that matter. That actually happened only because that whole thing was challenged. The church was challenged from within and from without. And by the way, when I say that they considered the Old Testament sacred writing, if you would study that, I have my Greek Testament here. It has at the end 50 pages, tables of references and allusions to either the Old Testament, but then there is also, allusions to the Septuagint, most of the books from the Septuagint, also those that are not included into the Old Testament canon. And there's also a whole number of allusions to so-called, apocryphal writings, because why would they not be referred to? I mean, when Paul is writing his letters, he's probably not straight quoting, but why would he not mention anything or touch anything that was mentioned in some of those well-known writings? Because he was not writing a Bible, he was just sending a letter. And these writings were known, and they're quite interesting. So they have, it's not that they're pure poison. Many of them are even included into the literature, early literature of Christians, were recommended sometimes to new believers to be read together with the holy writings. So there's nothing wrong with them, but we find them alluded to into the New Testament writings. But then what happens around 150 is two things. So there's two movements, among others, that challenge everything. And I'm sure Matt could probably even talk much better about me because you've been reading so much. There's two names that you might come across when you Google it, when you read articles. One is Marcion, and then the other one is Montanus. Both of them born or lived around the middle of the 2nd century. Marcion is a very interesting case. Marcion is a son to a congregation leader. And this is something still very rare. I mean, it's around 150, so there is still not so many churches, but here you have someone whose father already had been leading a congregation or involved in leading a congregation. And Marcion developed very interesting ideas and thoughts and theologies. In a nutshell, he was, among others, convinced that the Old Testament must be eliminated. He had a very dualistic worldview. He thought there is the real God, and then there is kind of what he called, said in Greek, demiurge, like another God, but that's not the real God. But he's the creator. So the creator for Marcion is not the real God. The creator is already someone who's actually fighting against God, and everything fleshly, everything that the Old Testament stands for, according to him, has to be eliminated. Likewise, any reference to the Old Testament in the New Testament or in those writings have to be eliminated. So most of the Gospels have to be thrown out. So at the end, he has a very, very narrow collection of books that he would consider canonical. So without the Old Testament, most of the Gospels and other parts eliminated. And he was extremely influential. So his movement, reached from Rome and Gaul until Mesopotamia. So he had churches and congregations all around the empire, and it was a growing movement that was actually threatening the church. It was almost like a second church against the church. And that was one of the reasons why theologians, bishops had to think about, well, is that okay that we throw away the Old Testament? Is it okay that we eliminate everything Jewish from the New Testament? So that was one of the movements that they had to react against. And then there was another one more in Asia, Montanus. The Montanist movement, I mean, if you summarize it in one sentence, it was more emphasizing prophetic experience, but prophetic in ecstatic ways partly. So we could also again use that term, maybe a bit charismaniac movement, and there were many of those. And that was, of course, then challenging also the authority of any other writing or any church or any leadership within the church. So these two movements were extremely influential. And it's exactly then when we see the first bishops or theologians, Christian writers, Christian thinkers, Christian congregation leaders starting to talk about what is actually the foundation of the Christian faith, which writings are to be recognized. And this is also when you could talk about doctrinal history starting. This is when we get into all these debates about who God is, who is the creator, is Jesus a man or God, or is he both, who is the Holy Spirit? So this is starting, and it's always starting in response to false teaching or challenges from within or without. The church would not have needed to do that without that. But then there's a couple of names that I'm just mentioning, and then maybe we can look at some of those documents. So very early, there's someone like Justin Martyr. So he was martyred, he died, he gave his life up around 165 AD. So he lived in the first half of the 2nd century. And he's one of the first to just stated that the Gospels should be recognized to be of the same importance as the Old Testament. So towards the end of the 1st century, we probably have a collection of Paul's letters. We have the 4 Gospels. There's actually some editions in Syrian churches that have gospel synopsis, where the 4 Gospels are kind of, written together in one book. But Justin is the first one who says, oh, at least the Gospels, they have the same standing, they should have the same standing as the Old Testament, which of course was already sacred writing. And then it goes very quickly that we have many people like Irenaeus, one of the great theologians of the 2nd centuries, who then has already a list of canonical books. He doesn't have Hebrews. He doesn't have 2nd Peter, 3rd John. So these are debated actually for some centuries. It's not really clear how he sees the book of Revelation, which is another difficult case, but he has most of the books in a list that he has in his writing. Clement of Alexandria again, 2nd century. He is the first one, it seems, who included Hebrews into Paul's letters. I remember my first German Bible that I got also still had Hebrews as a letter of Paul. So that is a tradition that goes back to Clement of Alexandria. It was always the question who wrote Hebrews, but he included it. He has also 1 or 2 books like an Egyptian gospel that we don't have in our New Testament, but again, 90-95% it's exactly the New Testament that we have today. But then we have an interesting document, and that's the Muratorian fragment. A scholar, a researcher by the name of Muratori, he found a document from the 7th, 8th century, which turned out to be a copy of a document that is dated back. And Matt, you were asking, so most people say 170 to 200 AD. It's a minor opinion that this is just the 4th century. Most people say this is reflecting the end of the 2nd century. And now I can show you something that you don't always have to look at my boring face. This is part of this document, of this fragment. And I'm just highlighting a few things because it's interesting how whoever wrote it was looking at the New Testament. So before that, there's a mentioning of the gospel. Also, it's a fragment, so there's nothing about Matthew and Mark because that's missing. But then he says, Paul, like his predecessor John, writes by name to 7 churches in the following sequence. So by that is meant the revelation of John. And there's at the beginning these 7 writings to the 7 churches. And there is a tradition in the early church that looked at Paul's letters and said, well, Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and so on, and Romans, that's 7 letters. So Paul is doing the same that John is doing. So this is how they order these writings, not chronologically, not by importance, just like this. Then there is a couple of other writings. He mentions in the middle, there's currently also an epistle to the Laodiceans, another to the Alexandrians, both forged in Paul's name. So already in the 2nd century, there's an awareness that there is writings that are ascribed to an apostle that are not actually written by that person. And here we just have to trust that these people have been very close to when these books were written, these letters were written, these documents. So that is what they know, and we have no way of verifying it. But there was already an awareness. There's writings that are forged. Then we receive only the apocalypses of John and Peter. So in that document, the apocalypse of Peter, this is one of the apocryphal writings, is possibly recognized. And then there is a mention of, the shepherd of Hermas and other writings. So that's one of the earliest documents that tells us anything about something like a list of New Testament books. And it's the same story. It's the same that I said earlier, like 90% of the New Testament are there. And that the remaining 10% are the open questions. And it's the letter to the Hebrews. It's the 2nd letter to Peter. It's 2nd and 3rd John. And it's the book of Revelation. These are debated for a number of centuries, actually. But this is all that needs to be clarified. So we have Paul's letters, we have the Gospels, we have the Catholic letters, the so-called Catholic letters, and then there's a few writings that are debated. But 90% of the New Testament are already considered, as we have it today, as the writings that are canonical. But then when we go to the 3rd century, there is someone like Origen of Alexandria, one of the greatest minds of that time. And he's the first one who's not only looking at historical or author qualifications, he's the first one who talks about inspiration. And he's just making the point that the writings of the Old Testament and that which is now going to be called the New Testament, they share the same inspiration. So he's trying to go deeper, and this is where you're starting to have a theology of hermeneutics and dogmatic thoughts about what is actually going on. What about the inspiration? Those are debates that then at the time of Reformation are coming up again and again, are hotly debated. So it goes back to to Origen. Then one of his pupils, Eusebius of Alexandria, he's writing a church history where he has a number of those writings. I think that document I can also show you because it's quite interesting to read. Let's see if that works. Yep. So that's again 4th century. And there's some differences here. So let's see what Eusebius is writing. So
Can I ask one thing first?
Yeah.
The previous slide that you had there,
Yeah.
it mentioned this this guy's name. Is it Marcion?
Yeah.
Or was the person mentioned in the slide, was it the same guy who had this weird teaching? It was somebody else.
Yeah. So that document is just named after the researcher who found it. So we do not know who wrote it. Yeah. But then,
no, but you know, but that Marcion is not the guy who had these whatever weird thoughts movement.
Oh, so that is Marcion, yeah. So Marcion and Montanus. So there's 2 of them. Marcion is the one who wanted to discard the Old Testament.
Yeah, so it was this guy's name mentioned in the previous slide. That it was said something there that you didn't go through it.
All right, yeah, you're right. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
exactly.
It said, you know, they're not trustworthy or something like that.
Exactly.
So he was the guy.
Exactly, that's exactly him. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And then Eusebius is the next one. He has, you know, a thorough list of all those writings, but note that he distinguishes at the end of 2 and the beginning of 3 that there's accepted writings, and then there's disputed writings, which are nevertheless recognized by many. And he has the epistles of James and Jude, and again we have 2nd Peter, and we have 2nd and 3rd John. So they're recognized by some, but not by everyone. So there's kind of 3 categories. There's accepted writings, there's disputed writings, and then there's rejected writings. For example, he mentions the Acts of Paul, the Apocalypse of Peter. Sorry, Peter, that we don't have you here. I'm referring to Adelaide's husband. And then there's a few others. And then you see that he is talking about the Apocalypse of John, and that indeed is debated for a very long time. It's often put into both. It's put into the readings that are accepted by everyone, and it's also put into the list of writings that are disputed by some. And so that continues throughout the 3rd and 4th century, that we have these debates. I think some of you asked, who looked already into this topic, why is it? I mentioned Montanus in Asia and this kind of ecstatic movement, prophetic movement, but really apocalyptic and very, very quickly rejected and seen as a threat. That was dominant in the East. So that means, you know, the eastern part of the church, the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. Maybe it is why the Revelation was looked at so critically exactly in this part until I think even the 10th century, if I'm wrong. Maybe it has to do with some of these tendencies. Because in the Western church, the book of Revelation was accepted in the 2nd century. Like nobody ever doubted it in the Western church. But then likewise in the Western church, the letter to the Hebrews, and probably because it was precisely unclear who wrote it, was very long looked at with suspicion, whereas in the East, that was most of the time accepted entirely or just with a reference that some have a doubt. But this is what we have throughout the 4th century. And actually the same that we've said about the Old Testament is true for the New Testament. Nobody ever made a firm decision. There was never a vote cast. But we have, on top of many of these ecclesiastical writers, we have letters that one bishop writes to another one, or we have some synods who make statements about these writings. But again, they just capture what everybody seems to be saying. And with regard to those books that are debated at some stage, they're simply saying, hey, let's go with what is accepted by most, as long as it can be traced to an apostolic writer, as long as it is not in contradiction with, you know, what all the other writings that are not disputed are saying. And then if it is really embraced by the majority, so let's include these books. And those have been then James, 2nd Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Hebrews, and the book of Revelation. And there we have the same development. And the earliest document that has exactly the New Testament canon as we have it today is a letter that the famous Athanasius, he was a bishop in Alexandria. He was one who wrote the first and most important treatise on why Jesus is both God and man, and both 100%. He was writing against a heresy that was claiming that Jesus was, not really man, and he was making the point why Jesus had to be fully man, otherwise he could not have redeemed us. And as a bishop of Alexandria in the year 367, he sends a letter to all his churches, as bishops do, and there he states exactly the list that we have today, and that is the earliest state of exactly the list of New Testament writings as we have them. And from there on, we find many synods in both East and West who just, confirm that statement. But again, it's happening. And the famous Swiss theologian Karl Barth said the canon, the biblical books, they have imposed themselves. There was these challenges that caused debates and required the church to respond. But the church was never in a position where anybody could have said, okay, we have the authority over these writings. The question was always, what authority do we have to submit to? And where do we recognize this authority of the biblical writings? And the Bible that we have today is the collection of the writings where the church recognized here is the authority, here is God speaking to us in a way he does nowhere else. So it is really not in our hands. It has never been a decision that was really entirely in the church's hand. So it is always just recording how these scriptures, as Karl Barth would have put it, have inspired themselves, have imposed themselves, have recommended themselves to the church. And then we could go for 1,000 years to the medieval times, where then at the time of Reformation, all the confessions of the Anglican and Swiss and German and all the Reformation churches confirm the canon. And what they do, they confirm that both the Old Testament and the New Testament are canonical writings. And the Council of Trent, which is the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic equivalent, they do the same. So they consider still the Septuagint books in addition, but a very important statement that same council, the Catholic Church, is making, and that so basically the entire Christian Church is making, is that both the Old Testament and the New Testament are sacred writings, are inspired writings, are to be considered canonical, and that there is no difference between them. And what Marcion has been doing in the 2nd century, this is what has been happening again and again, and even today, that parts of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, are considered or described as not relevant, not inspired, that we should disregard them, that they have nothing to teach to us. And through the centuries and through the millennia, the church always made clear that this is not the case, that the Bible consists of both of these testaments, that both of them, I could show you statements, very strong statements for those first centuries where, these ecclesiastical writers or bishops say the Old Testament talks about Christ on every page. And this is important for us. How do we read the Old Testament? I think we also are in a danger, actually, that we, push the Old Testament a bit to the background because we don't know how to deal with it. But when we talk about the canon, we definitely have to keep both of them together. So there's probably 1,000 of things that could be said, but I've been talking already 50 minutes. So you look very tired and completely asleep, but happy to ask any questions or clarifications. But that's what I have.
Great. Thank you, Pastor Samuel. That was really helpful. So any questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask your question.
The you said something about like David was considered a prophet. I mean, the Jews considered him as a prophet. Like, I think for us, we haven't really said that David or even Moses would be really prophets, right?
Mhm.
I'm just wondering because as I've been learning more about Islam, like they say that David and Moses were prophets. So maybe in that sense, they're closer to the Jews in this particular thing than to Christians.
I mean, there's the claim, which I think makes a lot of sense, that Islam is actually from its origins a Christian sect, and it's actually reflecting a lot of connections to what Christians or Christian sects would have been thinking at this time. In that sense, that's not a surprise. But then if you go to the Old Testament, there's the promise that God makes to Moses: I will raise a prophet greater than you, a prophet like you. And then the question of the Old Testament is, who is it? Is it Samuel? Is it Elijah? And we talk about Jesus as prophet, priest, and king, but also prophet.
Yeah.
So you're completely right. It's something that we ignore. What I can maybe add to this one, why is it that we look at the Old Testament books, or some of them, as historical books? Like in most of our Bibles, and Judges, Joshua, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, and so on, are considered or described even as historical books. I'm not sure, but that might be going back to Augustine. One of his great writings, where he also talks about the canon, is categorizing some of these Old Testament writings as historical writings. And what you can see there is really a lack of understanding, a widespread lack of understanding among almost all of the early theologians, in terms of how did the Jewish people, how did Jesus understand the Old Testament? How did he read it? And they didn't notice that, it shouldn't have surprised them when the early church, when the New Testament writers, when they describe who Jesus is, somebody said that 70% of the quotations they take from the book of Psalms. Why? Because it's written by David. It's ascribed to David. So this is where they take the prophetic references to Christ from. And there's, right away, very soon, this is completely forgotten. Of course, also down to the sad story between the Jewish people and the church, which has been very difficult from the very beginning. But there's a lot of ignorance actually there in those first centuries, and continues throughout. But good question, good point.
I was also wondering about this. Okay, these are like these Montanus and Marcion, if they were like in about 150 AD. Well, because like Islam has a lot of heresy teaching, at least from our point of view, or even Jewish point of view. If I don't know exactly what all kind of things these guys were teaching, but if they could be one of those sources, wrong sources for the Muslims to have in their book. But
I mean, there's, if as I said, so there's hundreds and hundreds of writings that you have, apocalyptic writings and so on, and you certainly would find a lot of material there. But the interesting thing is also much of that is just coming out today in the church in the same way. So, sometimes when people say, why is it that you have these crazy ideas? It never has been so bad. And then you just can say, well, go to the 2nd, 3rd century. It's everything has been there already. And, Peter and Paul warn about it. Jesus warns about it. So.
Yeah, I heard recently a friend here, a Finnish friend, who said he believes in I think it was the Gospel of Mary Magdalene or something like that. I was like, what? Yeah. So it's kind of scary. Like, where do you get that from?
And of course,
why now?
Some of you are sending, I received some questions. There was questions, for example, Da Vinci Code or other movies. Of course, both in Hollywood and elsewhere, there's a lot of excitement of trying to make a case that Christianity is not right. And I mean, I have all these books in my bookshelf. I can go there and I can tell you, that there's thousands of them and nobody ever recognized them. but who knows that? So it's very easy to say, you know, there's a Gospel of Thomas, or there's a Gospel of Peter, or an Apocalypse of this person, or Revelation to that person, and the church forgot about it. That's just not the case. The church was very well aware of that, and from the beginning said that, you know, this is not genuine. But there's a lot of that in the news, and I'm sure there will be much more, and it will come again and again. But you can always, you know, for example, in schools when you come across it, or young people, it's very fair to say, a fair statement, that despite there being many writings, it never was even so they were aware of that, but it was never even considered that they could be speaking the truth, were written by the persons they claimed to have written them. And, you know, it was so clear from the very beginning that with almost all of these writings that, you know, the question shouldn't be there, but it is there, and it is used again and again to discredit the church and the Bible.
Vielen Dank.
I would have two questions, and the first one is about the order of the Old Testament books, because I think you said that actually in the Hebrew Bible they're in a different order. Why and when did it happen that we have a different order now, and why don't we read it or have it in the actual Hebrew Bible order?
So maybe one thing to add first is that even the Hebrew Bible is not, it was never definitively defined in a way. So there's these three parts: the law, the prophets, and then the writings. So Psalms, Job, Proverbs, and so on. And for example, those writings, which have been the latest part to then really be considered canonical, there's different orders of those. And within Judaism, there was never seen a need to define the right order of them. Although most, as I said, have chronicles at the end. So that's the dominant one. But even in Judaism, there was, for very long, there was not a point to say, okay, we have to sort this out. But then why has it changed? I think it has changed, as I said, with Augustine and others who just didn't understand it. And even if you would go to the New Testament, if you think of the letters of Paul, the first collections have Romans as the last letter or as the seventh letter. It's that only later on that Romans is the first letter. Some of these collections have Acts as the last book of the New Testament before Revelation, until it's moved after the Gospels. So even there's a lot of movement. Luther actually moved James and Jude and Revelation to the end intentionally. James is not in the same place in Lutheran Bibles and in Reformed Bibles. So there is even some of these differences. But in the Old Testament, if you would now take the Jewish Bible, and as it has been mostly for the last 2,000 years, it is indeed so that we have these prophetic books, and then we have the writings at the end. And the last book of that would be Chronicles. But it's also, you know, as long as we know that, I think anybody teaching on the Bible, as long as we know that the Old Testament is considered as a whole prophetic, that's actually okay. That's enough. So we don't have to change it. We also wouldn't have to change the New Testament if we would find new writings. You know, there's this interesting case, some of you know that, with Corinthians. Paul is mentioning in 1 Corinthians a letter he had written before 1 Corinthians. And he mentions in 2 Corinthians a letter he has written, obviously between 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So there have been at least 4 letters of Paul to the Corinthians. We just have 2 of them. But even if now hypothetically we would find some documents, you know, we don't have to change anything. we could put it there, but all of the New Testament has the same center and core message, so we don't need to be afraid of that. But maybe it's good to be aware of that, because there is some implications. There was one, if I just can add, there was one question on the number of the Old Testament writings. Maybe Matt, you have come across it, that there's different numbers in the sources. So, for example, in the Old Testament, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah have been very long, and in all the manuscripts been considered one book. So that's one example, and it's just for actually, and then the Christian theologians, they thought it's better to have 2 books. And then in the medieval times, at some stage, then the Jews said, well, okay, no problem, let's make it Ezra and Nehemiah. But originally it was 2 books, 1 book. And this is why sometimes we have the number 22 for the Old Testament books in the Jewish sources, which is the numbers of the alphabet, which is kind of a nice concept to have, that you have as many books as the alphabet, but then others have 24 or more. So that's yeah, just the way it is.
My second question would be, maybe it's a rather weird question, but I was always wondering, like obviously the New Testament writings are more or less about and around Jesus' life, but talking about inspiration and just writings being inspired, why were there never, or why did the canon never extend, or why there were never other or new writings added? Or why don't we have, of course, like we have the Bible, but then we would have another collection of kind of inspired writings or anything? Because at least from what I believe, like in inspiration by the Holy Spirit didn't end. So like why, or was there maybe even a discussion about other writings later should be also considered as kind of more important, or at least put in some kind of canon?
Yeah, that's a good, this is a big question. If we talk about inspiration, then we could talk first about the Bible, but there's many ways that we could talk about inspiration. Every Christian is inspired by the Holy Spirit. Through every one of us, the Holy Spirit is speaking even today, and through the millennia we have thousands of writings that are deeply inspired. That I've been always surprised. Sometimes you pick up a 500-year-old book and you open it and you realize it is God speaking through someone else, and it changes your life and your heart. So there's no doubt that the Holy Spirit is at work and continues to be at work, and has also been at work in the writings. All the church fathers, have 20,000 pages in the bookshelf just of these writings, and it's just a fraction of that. And it's deeply inspired and deeply instructive. But then when we talk about the inspiration of the Bible, of the biblical writings, it's kind of a second category of inspiration. It is an inspiration that I don't have. So nothing that I'm going to say will ever be recognized in the same way as inspired as the New Testament writings, nor anything that has been said by anyone else. But the interesting thing is, if you think of Paul, Paul is very bold as one example in the claims that he's making about himself, about his authority, why he has the right to write to the Romans and to the Corinthians the way he did. But even as he's writing, he doesn't know that 100 years later, the church will say all these writings, Paul, that he wrote, they have the same quality like the Old Testament. I think even Paul didn't think about it. He probably wouldn't have challenged it necessarily, because he, was convinced he's writing the truth. But that is the mystery of the canon. This is why this famous Swiss theologian said the Bible inspired itself. There is something that we will not be able to explain to the very end. And there is a separation, a distinction between the Bible and every other writing, whether from the first century, whether the same time of the New Testament, or any time until today, which doesn't mean that they're not instructive. So, some of those early writings, they are very instructive. So you gain as you read them. But then again, it's not adding anything. Maybe that's the point.
Yeah, also from because I like have this discussions sometimes, and from what I heard, or some people also said, that actually in the Bible as we know it and in the canon, everything we need is said. So like there doesn't have to be more books or more things to be said or to be written down, but this is basically our foundation, everything we kind of need to know. So yeah.
Exactly.
It just, it's an interesting question.
Pastor Sam, I was curious about, I think First Enoch 9 is possibly quoted by Jesus in one of the Son of Man sayings, and then the letter of Jude, I think, mentions Enoch. So do you think that they thought of Enoch as being inspired in some way? And if they don't, why do they kind of reference it almost as being prophetic?
So there were a bunch of writings that even if you go to these early ecclesiastical writers, so church writers, they always mention a whole number of books that they recommend for reading and for instruction, but then not for authoritative teaching. And so that would be one of them. That would be a reading that they would have said, this is worth to read. This is inspiring. This is instructive. This has even maybe some prophetic qualities. So definitely worth reading it and engaging with it. But then they didn't recognize still the same quality that they saw in these other writings that they considered canonical or biblical. So there's many of these references. As I said, those are maybe the ones that you mentioned. They're maybe the clearest. But if you look at it, you would probably find hundreds of hidden or tiny references to some of those writings. So there would be many more books. And why would they not quote them? I mean, Paul in Acts 17 is quoting a Greek poet that we don't know who it is, but he thought, why not? So in that sense, it doesn't establish a case that because something is quoted or alluded to, therefore it is a holy writing. Also, if we look at the prophetical writings of the Old Testament, we would find many parallels to other writings. But just because they're parallels, it doesn't mean that they have the same quality, if that answers your question somehow.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if they saw Enoch as being like prophetic, like Jesus is using it like in reference to the Son of Man, like does that give that book some authority?
Well, you could, like if you talk about the Son of Man, so Enoch would also not be the only one. So actually there's a whole string of writings who would kind of make similar statements, similar comments. So it could also have been taken from somewhere else. And then still, if you go back to Daniel, then this is where it is even stronger and where you have the stronger argument. And then that whole book was never so there was always doubt about the real quality of that book, who wrote it. So it was always looked at with some hesitation. And just as has been the case with Peter and Hebrews and James, so they really wanted to establish, can we trust that it is possibly written by an apostle or by someone close to an apostle? And with Enoch, there was always the question, like, what about the authorship? So they were very hesitant to include anything that they were not sure about. Which is the reason why I believe, there was one of your questions that, so for me, all the New Testament books are written by the authors that they claim to be written by. Some of you might know that many theologians would doubt whether 2nd Peter is from Peter or 2nd and 3rd John is from John. Actually, in a way, they go back to these early questions in the first centuries. So that's maybe also good to see that there is a reason why you could ask that question. But I trust that if they have inspired themselves as they have, then why would I not consider them to be written by the person they claim to be written by? I think, yeah. But
do you think that letters like 2nd Peter could just be maybe someone compiled some of Peter's writings, together and then sort of like put it together into a letter or something like that? Because a lot of people will just reject the authorship, traditional authorship, because they think, well, that person didn't write it,
You know what? I don't know. I'm not sure if we care about this in heaven or in God's new heaven and earth. But I could imagine that Paul says, had I known this, I would have made sure who's been writing this letter. Because of course, what you mentioned, Paul has not written none of his letters with his own hand. There's this one reference that he's writing with these big letters, and because it was very difficult, then you had to be skilled. And of course, there is a possibility that, Paul was telling Timothy, or a secretary, or the same with Peter, could you write this letter and think of Peter and Paul teaching every day, thinking of someone accustomed to their teaching. Is that possible that some of those, for example, 2 Peter, came into being like this? Yes, it is. The only thing is we will never know it. And I remember another of my New Testament teachers, he used to say, you can read through the entire New Testament in 4 hours in Greek. Think of how little it is that we have. When I was 1 year abroad after high school, I wrote 150 letters home, and I kept a copy of all of them. And I'm sure, if you would read through those 150 letters, you would find differences in style and emotion and everything in language. And we have very few writings. And then that's what I never understood, or never convinced me in New Testament scholarship, of those who are so critical about these writings. It is so little that they have. And if you think of, Paul's life, the battles he's fighting, I mean, what is surprising about 2 letters being a bit different in style? Or the same with Peter. And we don't even know, in Peter's case, like, how far are they apart? We just don't know it. So much is possible, but we never will know for sure. And, none of them, I mean, had any of these New Testament writers known how confused some New Testament scholars would be millennia later, they would have made sure to write some dates, but they didn't even think that is necessary. Like some of the prophetical books have that, in the year of that king. So some of those we can trace. We are so happy that Paul has this one incident in Corinth with a Roman governor, Gallio. And because we can trace it in secular writings, this helps us to establish when Paul's writings have been written, but that's almost an accident. And I'm sure, like, had they known this, they would have made very sure, I'm sitting here, I'm writing at this year. But they didn't, they didn't. They thought this is absolutely not relevant. And if you turn that question around, those who make these questions relevant, or who debate it or doubt it, it's usually people who are not so concerned about the message. That's just, one way to put it, unfortunately.
And I like the idea that, of course, they wrote those letters, but they never thought that they would be canonized at some point. Like you were saying, if they knew, they would have written more details or names or dates or something. But and I like how you put it, or who originally said it, like the Bible inspired itself. Like it's still very, very much in harmony, despite of nobody was thinking to make a collection out of them.
Yeah, and some of you have been on the Alpha course. I love it when we talk about the Bible. This awareness. It's written over hundreds and hundreds of years by a variety of different authors, different professions, different life. I mean, it's you don't have anything like this. So I could never make a case this is why the Bible is a holy writing or is authoritative. But as a Christian, as a believer, I'm just amazed how something like this is possible. I mean, from Moses to John, it's thousands of years. And it's one book, and it speaks with one language. And this is what believers of all times always have recognized, that essentially this book is about Jesus. It's about God's love. There is, tensions and whatever, but if you ask what is the center, there's never been any generations of Christians that by majority would not have said it's all about Jesus. It's very clear. All of these books are connected, and no other collection of books known to man has this kind of quality. It's so this is what is clearly beyond us in many ways.
What I really like about some of the Old Testament books as well is all the lists of names, and it puts you to sleep when you read them, and this person came with one of those, and the next person one, and the next person one from that tribe. And it makes you realize just how conscientious they were in recording all these names. And to me, I find it fascinating actually to read through these names, because it just shows that every one of those people had a life, and they had no idea that they were going to become part of our canon, and that they would be recorded, you know, forever. And we know nothing about them, but they're all listed there as a historical record. I find that really encouraging and fascinating.
I do have one more question. You already talked about it a bit. It was about this numbering. And you said something like maybe some of them were numbered according to the Hebrew alphabet or something. But like sometimes there is a chapter division almost like between a story. Like, how did they do that? Like, why is it so?
Yeah.
And also, like, who decided that this verse belongs to, I mean, this phrase belongs to this verse, and then the next one belongs to the next, or is there any?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't, now the name has slipped my mind. I think it's around 1000 or 1200 that a monk in England, he was the one who put the chapters as we have them today. So there was one person who did it. And very obviously, Mario, they're not always very consequent and sometimes even misleading. So that's why one advice to everyone: when you study the Bible, always read context, always read around, read back and read forward. Sometimes when I'm going with the lectionary of the church, sometimes it's perfect, but sometimes I'm just annoyed, and I realized, you know, you have to give the context, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. So that's one of the ways. For the Old Testament, so the Pharisees, so those who were left, so after the temple was destroyed, and then 133, 35, everybody was, Jerusalem was destroyed, the Zealots were defeated. Was it 50, 60,000 or even hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed and deported. The Pharisees stayed, or some of them stayed. And then in Tiberias, they had their school. This is where they started to vocalize the Hebrew writings, the Old Testament writings, which, you know, up to then had just consonants, and they added the vowels. So they invented that system so that we would know how to pronounce them. And they were also the ones who then continued the process of, you know, putting also chapters together. But they are very different. So there's already in the time of the exile in Babylon, there was a Talmud that had different portions of scripture, but then it was different elsewhere. So there's a lot of variety in that. And those are not by any way, how would you say, holy or inspired. They're, for example, in the case of the book of Psalms, it is absolutely annoying that most of the English translations, the Protestant translations, they do not put the title in as a verse. So when it says from David as he was fleeing before Absalom, they just put it into a heading. In most Bible editions, it is already verse 1. So whenever you want to quote something from the Psalms, it's a mess, because you never know if you hit the right verse or not. Or this Sunday we have, you know, a reading from Joel. That is 3 chapters in some Bibles, it's 4 chapters in other Bibles. So there's a bunch of that. But that's just annoying. But in a way, it has no meaning, has no relevance. And the advice is always read whole books, read whole letters. Even before you reference a scripture passage with a passage from another writing or from another book, try to always see what is happening in that book itself. Like, for example, Paul, he has always these, 8 to 10 introductory verses, and we always run over them. But actually, in all of Paul's letter, they contain the very theme or themes that he's writing about. But it's a bit hidden. But if you read a letter carefully, and then you would go back to the beginning of Paul's letter, you realize, hey, it's like a table of contents. He's telling us exactly what he's going to do, but I never noticed it. And every single biblical book in its own way has these internal references, which means you learn most when you read them always kind of on a go. As much of it together, going back and forth. So the Bible is the best teacher to understand the Bible in that sense.
So the numbering, basically nobody knows exactly why they were put that way. I guess the scribes or whoever, they thought that would be the best.
Yeah, Yeah, they had a system for it, but then this guy, what was his name? Longimus something, this monk. I mean, of course, if one person is doing it for every biblical book, they cannot possibly understand or go so deep that they always make the right call. That's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
But we survive with it.
Yes.
Yeah,
it's still much better to have the numbers, even the way whatever we have it now, than not numbers at all.
There's the I don't know if any one of you knows the name Adolf Schlatter. He was a Swiss New Testament scholar beginning of the 20th century. He taught in Tübingen, where I've been studying, and he was a really biblical scholar, and he was world renowned at that stage. And he was said to have memorized the entire New Testament in Greek by heart, but he was equally famous for never being able to quote any passage correctly, kind of, chapter and verse. He had it memorized, he knew it, but most of his writing, it's all over the place. And the worst is, when he was dying, he had already, in his testimony, he had already designed the gravestone. And I do not know, it was a very beautiful verse that he wanted to be there, but because, of course, out of memory, he put the wrong quote, the wrong Bible quotation into his testimony. So they had no other choice than putting the wrong Bible quotation on the testimony. One of his pupils allegedly overnight tried to change it, and you can see it on the gravestone. But that's the way it is. I have a similar, not so famous experience. I cannot claim that I know the whole Bible by heart, but we read a lot of the Bible at home. So mornings and evenings, my parents read to us the Bible for all these 18 years that I lived at home. So I knew a fair deal of the Bible. When I went to university, Bible exams were easy, but also, I never knew the references. And then I went abroad the first time in an English setting, and then we had this missionaries coming, and they wanted everyone to say John 3:16 in their own language. And I was like, John 3:16, I have no idea what it says. And they were looking at me, okay, so you're not a Christian. I said, yes, of course I'm a Christian. Every Christian knows what John 3:16 is, but I had no idea. So before university, I never thought about memorizing verse numbers. So, it's not the most important thing, but now I recognize it's helpful at times.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Did I understand you right? Maybe I didn't quite get it, but did you say that the first instance when a New Testament book was written down, or when they started documenting from the New Testament, was James, and it was in 48 AD? But then I'm just wondering, that made me start thinking, were you talking about just the letters, or were you talking also about the Gospels? Because I'm just thinking, it just made sense. When you read the Gospels look like they're kind of like someone's diary. This day Jesus did this, and the next day he did this, and so in a way, I'm kind of wondering, do we know when the Gospels were written, and were they written way later, or how does that work?
So we don't really. And also with James, so that's one assumption. But for me, it would also make sense if you think of Paul's debate in Galatians about grace, about the law. It would make a lot of sense if you read James first, and you think that James could reflect very, very early Jewish Christian thinking that even predates Paul's letters. So that would make a lot of sense, actually. But then with the Gospels, we don't know it. So Matt would know all about that. At some stage, liberal scholars would doubt every writing and would date all of them much later than I or conservative scholars would date them. And they were convinced that the Gospels cannot be written before 70. Why? Because Jesus talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, and they were convinced that you cannot possibly know that. So if the destruction of Jerusalem is mentioned by Jesus, it must have been the disciples who made it up after Jerusalem actually was destroyed. So that's what you will find in some mainline scholarship. But actually, then even people like this theologian that I quoted, who doesn't believe in God, he was making the point that, all these things that Jesus says about the destruction of Jerusalem, those are commonplaces that you would say about the destruction of any city. So there's nothing specific in it, actually. And of course, when you then take into the fact that Jesus probably indeed knew what was happening, you could date the Gospels much earlier. But then it's a question in itself. It's hotly debated. Many think that Mark might be the first Gospel, the earliest of the three synoptic Gospels. And of course, if you think of the Gospels very clearly, there's already a process behind them of collecting some of these, sayings and stories in different ways. And that suggests that that process might have taken a bit longer than, for example, James or Paul writing a letter. They didn't need any preparation for that. They were just writing into a specific situation. If you compare the Gospels and you think of the whole question of historicity, it's maybe that's digressing partly, but maybe it answers a bit to your question, Fiona, and gives a picture of that. When we talk about history, we talk about naked facts, historiography. Like, sorry, Matt, this is maybe not the best example, but 9/11. Everybody would say, I don't know, is it the East or the North Tower fell first at that exact time, and then the other tower at that exact time. Like any newspaper report that would mix those up would be kind of torn apart, and we would say, well, how can you even do that? But we have only actually 200 or 300-year-old understanding of history as history recording the facts. This is a modern understanding. At the time of the Bible, history was always about meaning. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter whether something happened or not. This is again what some New Testament scholars sometimes allege. It doesn't matter even if Jesus rose from the dead. Well, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5:15, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, all faith is futile. But then think of the temptation of Jesus. There's these three incidents, right? Jesus is tempted in three ways, and one of them is the temptation on the temple, and then one is on a mountain where the devil shows him all the kingdoms. Now, if you think of Matthew and Luke, who both have it, we do not know who wrote first, but it seems that both of them have received the same story, whether Luke is copying from Matthew, because Luke was not an eyewitness, and Jesus probably had no eyewitness. He was tempted alone, so he was sharing his disciples the temptation. Now, Matthew is writing to a congregation that has probably many Jewish Christians in it. He, just like Moses, has 5 books, and the Psalms, the Torah of David, is divided into 5 books. Matthew has 5 speeches of Jesus in his gospel. So he really models his gospel in a way that it would speak to Jewish readers. Then at the end of the gospel, you have a mountain where, but then also the Sermon on the Mount is on a mountain in Matthew. And of course, Matthew has many references where Jewish readers will think of, Moses, he's always the guy on a mountain. To Luke, that is absolutely irrelevant. He has the Sermon on the Mount on a field. Well, Jesus was preaching in Galilee, so if you come from the Alps, that is a field. If you live in Finland, you might consider it hills. But so Jesus has been preaching that mountain, that sermon. Matthew put it in a setting that spoke to his readers. Luke has one that spoke to his readers. Now, when you think of the temptation, the last temptation in Matthew's gospel is Jesus' temptation on a hill, on a mountain. In Luke's gospel, the last temptation happens in the temple. But Luke starts his gospel in the temple. Luke ends his gospel in the temple. Luke makes references to the temple and the Holy Spirit in a way that the others don't do. So that's one of his themes. So he received the temptation of Jesus, and he thought, well, actually, it doesn't matter at all now which of these happens first. But in the flow of the gospel, it makes probably sense if I put the third one as third one, the one when Jesus is tempted in the temple or on the temple. For that writing, or for them, this is no way of kind of being ahistorical or kind of misrepresenting something. So there was some way that they were not tied down so much as we are to just telling the facts. But what was important for them is always the meaning. And this is very important for the Old Testament, and this is where Old Testament scholarship always goes into the wrong direction, because all the history that is told there is told for the sake of meaning. It doesn't absolutely matter to know all the historical details or be able to verify them, because many times we can't. But anyway, these writings are about what God is actually doing. And you could know all the historical facts about the Old and the New Testament, but not understand anything about what God actually wants to say, vice versa. But that was a long detour. But so Fiona, so that's the reason why probably the Gospels might be a bit later than some of the early letters, because they reflect already a process of collecting material, arranging material, which probably will have taken some time. And yeah, it would be great to find sources of that material that they've been collecting, because John tells us that it's only a fraction that they have been putting into the Bible, unfortunately. But again, we have to live with that. But another thing, Fiona, at the same time, the reason why the Gospels were first accepted, so that's what I stated, was that everybody said, well, they are applying to everyone. And initially there was some hesitation towards Paul's letters, because Paul was writing just to a specific group of people. It's a very, very interesting. But that was only very shortly that there was some hesitation. And it was very clear that the Gospels are written for everyone in a way. But then for Paul's letters, they really had to understand, despite written to the Romans and the Ephesians, they apply to the whole church. So in that sense, the Gospels always had kind of a priority or a standing that even the other writings didn't have right away.
You were mentioning that some would date the Old Testament to much later. I guess if they hold to the documentary hypothesis, which you kind of have to bow down to if you're in, Old Testament scholarship, what would you say as far as like the Pentateuch? Do you think that there's good evidence that they've always been together, in that set of 5? And what's the evidence that they're like earlier than, I guess, 6th century is when some would date it?
Yeah. I mean, if you read the Bible, I mean, there is even in First Kings and in Samuel, there's references to Moses. Even in David, David's comments, there's references. David's Psalms, there's references to the Torah. So I would say definitely already at that time, it would seem logical that it existed in one way or the other. Of course, like we never are able to establish exactly like what did it look like. And I've never been so excited about these source critical theories, but at least I need to acknowledge that there's also a reason why they came up, because when you read the Old Testament, sometimes it seems repetitive. If you read some of these, especially in the 5 books of Moses, some of the stories, there seems to be these repetitions. And then when you go to the Hebrew, it indeed seems to be the case that maybe even 2 versions or 2 traditions have been put together, and out of reverence they didn't want to combine them, they just put them into the same text. Now, did it happen exactly like this? Nobody knows. These are pure hypotheses. We can't know. But then for example, the account on Abraham, it says, is it Genesis 12 or 13, that the Chaldeans lived in that area. And from all we know about history, we can tell that when Abraham was there, the Chaldeans didn't live there, but that was much later. So that there's some of these comments that reflect that, at least when these books were compiled or edited, sometimes explanations were added so that future readers would actually understand it. And so sometimes you really see that there's a history in these texts. But again, so I wouldn't see why they would not be much earlier and much older than is often assumed. But it's even for conservative scholars, it's of course extremely difficult to prove it. It's just because we just have what we have.